Welcome back to the podcast. It's Aaron Renn. My guest today is Darel Paul. He is a professor of political science at Williams College. He's also the author of a book you may have heard of before called From Toleration to Equality: How Elites Brought America to Same-Sex Marriage. He's written a number of articles out there that are all good, but today we're here to discuss one he wrote for First Things magazine earlier this year called Feminism Against Fertility, which is, again, what we're going to discuss today. And there's a link to that article, his book, and other ways to find him in the show notes. So be sure to check that out. Darel, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you very much, Aaron, for inviting me. Yeah, I'm really glad to be here.
You had a very provocative paragraph in this article, which is really the reason I said I wanted to talk about it, because it's not usually framed this way. You write, quote, "In the 21st century, we are experiencing a profoundly consequential retreat from lifelong socially binding care relationships, including marriage and parenthood. This retreat is being led by women, a social fact recognized by everyone from TikTok tradwives to academic feminists. The consequences of the retreat will literally be epochal. Across the globe, rich democracies are pioneering a society such as was never seen before in human history, one in which women's lives are no longer ordered towards care." Unquote. Can you explain, what you mean more by this idea of reordering away from care and these relationships?
Sure. Yeah, I thought that was kind of a way to sum up much of what I was interested in trying to communicate in that piece. It certainly has things to do with issues like fertility. And over the last couple of years, people have begun to get this on their radar screen. That fertility rates are very low, not just in Western countries, but all around the world, and that this is going to have really dramatic society changing effects, probably even over your and my lifetime, and certainly the lifetimes of our kids. But what I think people are not talking about is this other dimension, this retreat from what I call these socially binding care relationships. And it's being led by women. It contradicts so much of what at least I grew up with, and this sentiment that women want these kinds of relationships, women want to get married, women want to have children. It's men who are the difficult ones, men who are resisting, men who are afraid to commit, all of these kinds of tropes that we're probably all very familiar with. And looking at the data, it's actually the opposite. I mean, it's not a huge gap, but the difference is that women are the less interested, the less likely on all of those things. And so I think that the kind of social dimensions, the gender relations of this transformation are so enormous that we really need to start thinking about them and start talking about them.
Yeah, you had another line. You mentioned how all of our assumptions, including the assumptions of the church and the sort of marriage literature of the church, are sort of been inverted, in this new world. It's always been assumed women want to commit, it's men who are dragging their feet, as you said. But as you write, female empowerment and gender egalitarianism. Oh, sorry, got the wrong one. Pew also found that childless women aged 18 to 34 were 12% less likely than childless men of the same age to say that they want to be parents someday, and 6% more likely to say they definitively don't. There is a similar gender gap when it comes to coupling. Among 18 to 39-year-olds, single women are 6% more likely than single men to say they're not looking to date. That is wild to think about. I see these stats. It's like young men are more likely to say, right, that having a kid, it's essential to the good life. Women are prioritizing other things. Do you think this is something that is like widely understood, or are we still locked into a, historic paradigm?
Oh yeah, I think in terms of the public discourse, we're still locked into that old way of thinking. I think people. I mean, there's always been, especially since the 1970s, right, in Western countries, this kind of feminist sensibility, I don't think it's really been dominant, but it's been a very important strain of discourse in our society that women should, at the very least, put these things off. There's always been a more radical strain that is, women should abandon relationships with men, et cetera, et cetera. But I think that's always been thought of as kind of a weird fringe idea. But as we go on into the 21st century, I think we're seeing quite different kinds of data and quite different kinds of behavior. And so, therefore, it's much more likely for women to express these reluctances, women to say that they're either not looking to date, they enjoy being single, they don't want to have children. And I think so a lot of times this is kind of blamed on men, quite frankly. It's that, well, the reason why women don't want to date, the reason why women don't want to marry is because there's something wrong with men in our society. And I don't think all is well with men. Obviously, your podcast and your work is devoted to kind of exploring lots of the issues that men face in contemporary society. But I think the dominant narrative is any of the reluctance of women to enter into these kinds of relationships is also kind of because men can't get jobs, because men can't earn high enough wages, because men are trying to play the field too much, at least if they are kind of elite men. And so part of the reason why I wanted to write this piece as well was to try to balance out some of the discourse and some of the arguments.
Yeah, well, probably there is, as you said, there probably is some role that men have played in this. But what do you think the other factors are that are sort of driving this change?
I mean, there's a lot of social changes going on, and I think that's and cultural changes, and I think that's a lot of what people tend to look at. And so, when we're thinking about things like the fertility decline, when we're thinking about the decline in marriage, we're thinking about, especially among the young, when we think about the decline of coupling, and this is all across not just the Western world, right? Lots of poorer countries are facing the same kinds of futures and same kinds of problems. Um, I think that lots of times we rush to kind of cultural explanations. And a lot of it is because it's happening in so many different places all at the same time. And so economic arguments seem difficult to be convincing because if it's happening in the US and it's happening in France and it's happening in Thailand, what do these places share? So there's lots of theories going on out there, and I don't think, at least I personally haven't seen enough research to give me any confidence that any answer is terribly convincing. But we've got arguments about, again, culture. We've got arguments about housing and housing prices being so high. We've got arguments about gender relations, which I think is an important part of this. We have arguments about the politicization of views of family. So especially in a country like the United States, people on the left and people on the right had pretty much the same views about the value of family and children and all of that. Now it's very different. There's a big gap between people on the right and people on the left on these issues. And then we have technological arguments, things like it's social media. It's people who would rather, chase after a fancy car or be famous online or do OnlyFans or whatever it is, rather than do these more mundane things like pursue employment, find someone to marry, and start a family.
Yeah, what do you think the role of ideology is? Because as you noted, academic feminism, go back to second wave feminism. It's like not only we're going to destroy the patriarchy, we're going to destroy the family, we're going to destroy heterosexuality. That's always been big in the academy and in sort of the professional movements. And you mentioned that in South Korea, there's this 4B movement that is sort of, call it a radical feminist movement. The 4Bs are the four no's. It's
Mm-hmm.
like, don't get married, don't date, don't have kids. I can't remember what the other one is, but it does seem that that can't explain everything because it's happening in a range of different, environments. It's happening in highly egalitarian, what you might think of as feminist societies like the Nordics. It's also happening in very traditional societies like in East Asia, where, whatever the 4B people are, it's like a minority of South Korea is still
Sure.
a very traditional society in a lot of ways. China, again, Taiwan, Japan, Singapore, these are hardly bastions of, radical feminism. So you can kind of tell a story where, on the one hand, feminists may say, well, it's the patriarchy in East Asia. You might say it's the feminism and the Nordics, but it seems like no matter what your sort of culture and ideology, it's happening. It's happening in Iran, of crazy places like you would never expect. Is there an ideological factor, or is it something else?
Yeah, I mean, when you talk about ideology, I think lots of times we'll rush to things that are more obviously political. So something like feminism, for example. But I think the kinds of, kind of academic feminism, ideological feminism, is not the more important part of this. Sometimes the people use that kind of language, but I think the kind of feminism that is a lot more important is the kind of, shall we just say, empowerment feminism. That has really been adopted by all governments, or at least almost all governments. Yeah, maybe it's not in Saudi Arabia, but it's got to be almost everywhere else. This is the kind of feminism that becomes normalized through things like the Beijing Conference on Women back in 1995. It is a claim that development, and this is appropriate especially for developing countries, but I think it's true for developed rich countries as well, is that the full participation of women in society and the workforce and everything is absolutely essential to making a developed and wealthy and successful society. And so it's an argument that women would do well to, and then the claim is, well, at least put off things like marriage and childbearing, to pursue things like career, self-improvement, whatever it might be on that angle. But I think the premise or the assumption was, well, people will still just go do all that other stuff. People will still want to get married and they'll want to have children. They'll just do it a little bit later. And I think as we've seen in especially countries like the Nordics, that's not true anymore. The kind of postponement and recuperation story seems to be finished now, and that you actually have a decline in an interest in all of these activities, as well as a decline in the performance of these activities. So is it something broader? I think maybe social media is a vector for it, but we might think about it as kind of old notions of materialism. But I would say, and this kind of ties into some of my earlier work, I think we've got a therapeutic culture that marriage may, or coupling may still have a part to play in that. But I think these lifelong bonds, and particularly when it comes to children, they have a very tenuous position in this new culture. So I would less call it kind of ideological, and I think more deeply a cultural transformation that we've seen, certainly in the last 10 to 15 years, but obviously with deeper roots.
Yeah, so my wife and I are both Generation X. And if you look at the stats around Generation X, very few people never married. So there's still something like the last time I saw it, that only like people who were born 1980 or before, only like 12% never got married, and
Mm-hmm.
people. But I do think what happened is you saw people got married later. You got married later. So again, I was let's just say I was pretty old when we got married. My wife I think was 37. So we had one kid, and she's got friends of her age that got married, and at an age where they didn't have any kids, but they got married. And so I think there's been this idea that like somehow that the falling fertility rate is a byproduct of later marriage. People are getting married, but maybe there's an ignorance. Read a lot about this. Many people are unaware of how difficult it can be to have a child even over the age of 30. Like
Mm-hmm.
fertility falls off fast. At the same time, it does seem like even coupling is now in decline. And that people say, a quarter to a third of millennials will never marry. Maybe they will, maybe they won't. But we certainly see might call it the battle of the sexes coming back among young people, particularly among Generation Z,
Mm-hmm.
where there is this sort of a little bit of, it's not just that we're prioritizing careers and we ended up getting married later or whatever. We didn't have kids or we missed our runway. Now it's like there is sort of a battle of the sexes with like the Andrew Tates and the Manosphere guys on the one side and the 4Bs on the other, and it doesn't look good, in terms of intersexual dynamics. What do you think of this sort of this emergence of this battle of the sexes kind of thing among younger people?
Yeah, I'm Gen X as well. I was born in 1967. I grew up with those TV shows. Maybe you remember them as well, right? The Battle of the Network Stars, and you kind of have the
Yeah,
men versus the women and all of this stuff. That was a very 70s kind of thing. I think our gender woes, is what I call them in the article, are politicized to some degree. I don't think they're very strongly politicized, but I think they're real. And it's it's hard to know. I mean, I think I'll say this. I think we need to break down a lot of these phenomenon by different kind of strata of society. So, for example, when we look at marriage, people with high levels of education and high levels of income, they still get married. They still get married about the same rate that they did back in the 1970s or 1980s. It's people lower down the socioeconomic ladder that aren't getting married anymore. People who are kind of mid-range, people who are working class, they're not getting married anymore. So when we think about some of these issues, I think class is an important part of the story. Why aren't working class, even increasingly middle class people in America, at least, certainly getting married anymore? There is a claim that, and I think this is there's a good amount of data to disprove this, a claim that cohabitation and more informal kinds of coupling will just replace marriage. And so people historically, certainly in the United States, would point to the Nordic countries and say, well, sure, hardly anybody gets married anymore in Norway, but all the kids are born to couples and they're born to cohabitating couples and they have these very long-term cohabiting relationships. And so therefore it's essentially marriage, just without the legal recognition. And I don't think the evidence supports that. The instability of relationships in the Nordic countries is pretty close to the same in the United States if you look only at whites, Hispanics, and Asians. Um, those groups and the Nordic countries have pretty much the same levels of instability. And so I think we have some difficulties, primarily, I think, of class. And some of that's going to be income, but some of that's going to be culture as well. Hopefully, right, because I think a lot of this is so class inflected, that gives us some hope that there might also be some economic dimensions to this that we could actually carry out in terms of public policy. But I think looking at kind of racial and class differences across these markers is something important. We get a better traction on what's going on.
yeah, definitely. Non-marital cohabitation is much less stable than marriage. My wife and I read a lot of Norwegian novels, and it always seems to feature a couple that, even if they were either married or not married, they had a kid when they were together, but then that relationship didn't last. And it seems like, just because you were together when you had the kid doesn't mean that you stayed together for the long
Indeed.
term, or this was de facto marriage. And yeah, and it's interesting to think about. Again, it's such a global phenomenon, and it makes it that's what makes it very difficult to really figure out exactly what happened. It's sort of like the infamous WTF happened in 1971. You look at like all the malaise that sort of hit all these trends, and to use a Peter Thielism, it's overdetermined. There's a million
Sure.
explanations that you can have, but none of them seems entirely satisfying as to what really happened with these changes, and they seem very resistant to policy interventions to reverse as well. Most
Indeed.
of the pro-natalist policies haven't really done a whole lot uh, to even get up to raise it at all, much less getting back to even replacement level. What are the
Yeah.
implications for our societies of the path that we're on, assuming it doesn't change?
Wow. Assuming it doesn't change, we're looking at a rapidly aging society. That's the first thing that's going to hit. I mean, it's hitting already. We see that in lots of countries. The United States aging a little more slowly. Our fertility rate's a little bit higher. We've got more immigration than most countries in Europe, for example. but a rapidly aging society is what's going to hit first. I'm teaching a course this semester. We did a section on Social Security. The Social Security Trust Fund is going to run out of money. The projected run out date is 2032. So there you go, Aaron. That's something that you and I have to really think about. I mean, and where's that money going to come from? We have a lot more old people and a lot less young people because the fertility rate has been rather low for a long time. So that's the first thing. The second thing, obviously, will be continual, I think, political struggles over immigration. This issue is not going to go away. I don't think it's going to go away in any of our lifetimes because there's going to be a lot of pressure to import lots more people from all over the world because the natives aren't having children. And this is going to be particularly acute in places in Europe, which are, more hostile to immigration than, say, the United States is. But obviously, we've had our backlash too because of the extremely high levels in the Biden years. So I think that's the second one. And then certainly the third one is eventually going to be population decline. You've already seen that in some countries. You already see it in places like Japan and in China. And you see it in some parts of Southeast Asia, right? Thailand's fertility rate is as low as anybody else in the world. I mean, they're pretty close to where South Korea is,
not even a rich
Taiwan.
country.
Yeah, indeed. And you've got, India, which is got a huge number of poor people, is below replacement fertility now. So you're going to see in lots of places this won't happen in our lifetime, certainly, but in other parts of the world it's already happening, or it's going to start happening very soon. In most of Europe, you'll start to see depopulation. And so I think the most important early part of the depopulation story is population movements. So away from rural areas, away from small towns, into bigger cities. And so you'll just see depopulation of rural areas first. And we're already seeing this in places in Eastern Europe, like in the Balkans. We're kind of seeing a slow motion version of it where I live here in Western Massachusetts. We're about as far away from Boston as you can get and still be in Massachusetts. And we've had population decline since the 1970s. So that's kind of a sweeping element here of what we're going to see. And then we have all kinds of fiscal problems and social problems, I think, that come out of all of that.
Yeah, it's interesting to look at. Japan has ghost towns. I mean, there's just literally places that disappeared. There are many places in rural Spain that are down to a small number of elderly residents. No one wants to go there. Once something becomes, that kind of a demographic structure, it's very difficult to attract anyone young to be there, because there's no economic growth. It's an economic decline zone. Nobody wants to be in a place with low economic opportunity. The services degrade. There aren't a lot of peers for your children. And so it becomes the so-called, they talked about an urban doom loop. This becomes like the rural doom loop.
Yes,
in a lot
I
of
think
places.
so.
What I see in the United States is, there are some places in sort of the Great Plains that may be heading that direction. But a lot of these places are kind of being propped up by, a corporation will move a meat packing plant into this rural area, and it becomes essentially staffed entirely by illegal migrants. And so there is a sort of symbiosis between kind of a low regulation, low cost, rural manufacturing and distribution, combined with large numbers of immigrants, high numbers of them illegal, some legal, but it'll be interesting to see what then becomes of these places, over time. There's really no, these places are only, companies are only going there because of ultra cheap labor and the ability to essentially offload the social costs onto, states and the federal government. So, but we haven't had the ghost town phenomenon here yet, but it's happening in other countries.
Yeah, I think because our fertility rate has been higher than most other developed countries, right? As recently as 2007, the United States was above replacement in terms of our fertility rate. So it hasn't been that long, and so these movements are going to be a lot slower in a place like the U.S., but they're going to be a lot more rapid in parts of Europe. I mean, it's a lot slower in places like Canada and Australia too, even though like Canada's fertility rate is much lower than the United States, but then they have extremely high levels of immigration. And so, if that's the policy that mix that you want to have, you can certainly have it, and it will keep your labor force high. But then you're going to have very rapid population replacement over time. And then you're going to have all these questions about assimilation. Obviously, in Canada, you have the English versus the French conflict that presumably would only become more intense over time. And then you've got the rise of things like right wing populism. So we get Reform Party in the UK, and we get AFD in Germany, and these kinds of political movements aren't going to go away either, because I think they're born of this contradiction from not wanting huge amounts of immigrants and yet at the same time not being able to produce any children. And so that's just a very difficult place to be. You could be a country like Hungary, and you're not going to have many immigrants, but you're not also going to have children either. And so that's a different kind of struggle. It might be possible to do today and for a while, but over the medium run, the Hungaries of the world, the Polands of the world, they're going to start shrinking rapidly, just like the Bulgarias of the world.
I guess my final question would be: you're an individual young man or young woman, or maybe you're not so young anymore. Take it wherever which way you want. What should you do in this environment that we're in?
hmm So I think I mean, some of what I'm going to say, I think is not all that controversial, or maybe it might be controversial, but certainly shouldn't be. Um, I think that young people in particular, should try to make themselves attractive as a mate, and that doesn't necessarily just mean about physical attractiveness, but to build up certain kinds of skills. I think men in particular need to build their skills to be able to obviously support themselves and to express to young women, or maybe even not so young women, that they're a good catch, that they're somebody who can commit, and somebody who you really has something to offer into a relationship. I think particularly in thinking about the role that the church can play. Historically, obviously, the Christian church, has been very keen on marriage, and used to do a lot to try to bring young people together and provide all kinds of activities and social environments so that young people could meet each other and find out whether they liked each other or not. And so a lot of these kinds of institutions, and the role I think that the church used to play, a lot of that has just withered away. And so I think very self-consciously having organizations in our society that think of kind of a matchmaking role, not so much as, that boy and that girl over there, but just opportunities for young people to come together. We've seen, right, especially among the working class and increasingly the middle class, that these kinds of coupling relationships, and especially marriage, are disappearing. So I think a focus on those groups and the role that the church can play, I think, is something that we really could think about a lot more than we do.
Well, my guest today has been Darel Paul. He's a professor of political science at Williams College. We've been discussing his First Things article, Feminism Against Fertility. There's a link to that, his book. I'll put his Twitter in there. Got a good Twitter account. You want to give that a follow. And everything else you need to find in the show notes. So, Darel, thank you so much for joining me.
I was really glad to be here, Aaron.